Is the climate crisis, what it is and what each of us can do about it. And in consequence, we've looked not only at what the climate crisis is, that was really the first 3 weeks globally, locally, we've looked at it, but then what we can do about it, personal actions, collective activism, political action, and communication of different sorts, and so forth. And we've also noted these are often deeply interconnected, they're intersectional in some sense. So today what I'm going to do is actually put together a list for you. I've put together a list of 20 things that each of us can do about the climate crisis. These should all seem familiar because we've been addressing them pretty much from the beginning of the class. 2 lists of 10. First is going to be on personal action. Second is going to be political and collective action. And actually, there's a bonus. So it's really 21. The 20 things anybody on the planet could really do, but it's really focused on the way this course has been focused on talking to people in wealthy countries. But the last one, the bonus one, is really just for people in university like you. So take our first iClicker poll. This should look familiar. I'm giving it to you again. This is the questions, 3 questions that we had already. Oops, let me go back. 3 questions we've already had on the final exam, from the final exam. Keep in mind, and why I gave you this question is this particular one comes from one of the pre-recorded lectures. Make sure you watch those pre-recorded lectures. You can, you can speed them up if you wanted to. You can just listen to them. You can speed it up and listen if you want to, or you could read them. And those are the transcripts of those are in its entirety. So the transcripts of the ones coming from the lectures I deliver here, like the one that will get posted for this one today, are not complete insofar as the PDF just has like these, what shows here for the most part, bullet points and all. But anyhow, the people have said, yes, perfect. So most people know this. I hope you know it just to know it rather than you got it, oops, from remembering from last time. But okay, next one. It is a capstone for the course, the lecture for today. It's going to be a recap, but I think it's useful to bring everything together, to sort of pull together everything that we've talked about and why what we've done is important here. If you find it redundant, and you may find this redundant today, that's a good thing because it means you've been paying attention. If you're hearing some things that seem entirely new and you're kind of blindsided by that, you shouldn't. Everything here should, for the most part, seem pretty familiar to you. There's going to be new material, but the overarching themes are the same. Okay. So I noted in the section on Cowspiracy that Jonathan Safran Foer, a well-known writer, you may have read him, published a book recently, 2018 maybe, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast, where he argued that each of us should adopt a largely plant-based diet if we want to save the planet from catastrophic climate change. Hence, saving the planet begins in this view when we eat breakfast and otherwise. It's a useful way to look at it. Saving the planet in some measure does begin at breakfast and as the first meal of the day, the rest of the meals of the day. Yeah, it would be great if it were that easy. And in fact, I remember there was a comment someone made in Cowspiracy that they were stunned to find that just switching to a largely plant-based diet wasn't going to be enough to save the planet, that they thought that that was all there was to it. And if you read the title of this book, you might think that's all there was to it. It's not. And, one of the things in particular here is we've seen that, food systems, the food sector releases about 1/3 of the methane that goes into the atmosphere. The problem is the fracking industry is responsible for a little more than 1/3 of that, than the beef industry. And CO2, of course, is a much bigger problem than methane, all things considered. So there are lots of things that have to be attended to. You can't just do it by eating. In fact, if you think you're going to solve the methane problem just by eating, you won't, because, for example, fracking, and that's fracking for fossil fuels, principally oil and so-called natural gas methane, that's an even bigger problem. So we can't just stop with that one thing. It is an important thing, and I actually have it on the list, but it's not enough. You can certainly help save the planet at the breakfast table. And in fact, there are going to be two things that you can do here, which you already know, but I'll sum them up. But it's not nearly enough. It's just not nearly enough. And by the way, of all the things we're going to talk about, all the things we have talked about, there's no one thing that is enough. There's no, silver bullet that will solve everything. It has to be a range of things. This is collectively, arguably, the largest problem humanity has ever faced together. It is an existential problem. What hangs in the balance is the future of our civilization on this planet. So it's just not going to be that simple. And also, we need to be clear about something. Regardless of what we do, the planet will continue on. So the phrase "saving the planet," you're not saving the Earth, obviously. It almost always implies, when you say that statement, that we're saving it for ourselves. So if you hear someone say "save the planet," it almost always means save the planet for human beings. That's sort of the unspoken but really their thing. But we need to think about this more holistically, about other beings that inhabit the planet as well. So a more equitable and less anthropogenic way of looking at it would be to finish it out by saying save the planet for all life on it. And even, by the way, if you're totally anthropogenic and you just care about human beings and you just care about yourself, you better be thinking of it this way too, because we are in a deeply enmeshed ecosystem, and if we don't save the rest of the life on the planet, it's going to cause lots of problems for us. It already is causing problems for us. But so we're not really saving the planet, but I'm going to use that phrase because it's been out there for a long time. So Fowler, I think, is on to something. Is what he proposes is certainly what I would call a humanities approach, what we've been taking since the first day of class, as he focuses on human change, not technological changes, but human action. So what's the action change? Well, change to a largely plant-based diet. That's not a technological thing. You don't need new technology to do that. You can just go ahead and do it. People would like to think the technology is going to solve everything, and it can solve an enormous amount, but so much is individual action. And, you can see where people even try to employ technology here, right? So Impossible Burgers, that sort of stuff, where you're looking to make substitute for meat, or maybe actually grow meat cells in a lab somewhere, ultimately a factory, in vitro biofabricated meat. But at the end of the day, it's human choices that have to come into play here. But again, it's not just the one human action that we need to change. So I'm going to start off with 10 examples of what we can do that are in this vein. So these are personal actions, cultural actions, individual actions in some way. So here they are, top 10. Saving the planet begins, number one, at markets and restaurants when we buy enough to eat and no more. So we've seen this, right? Remember Project Drawdown, number one thing on the top of the list, food waste. So, and by the way, that's in the second half of the class. This could show up on the final. So food waste is a huge problem in the United States and globally. Peter Kalmus succinctly notes in the reading we did, and I'm quoting him here, about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to food production, and about 1/2 of this, 15% of all global emissions, are due to livestock, mainly cows. So Project Drawdown notes we can draw down more greenhouse gas emissions by addressing food waste than by switching to largely plant-based diets. And that's a surprise to many people. We've heard so much, in part because of Cowspiracy and things like that, that it's just about not eating beef. It's important. But even bigger, slightly bigger, also related to food, is not wasting food. But while Freegan might be more important than being vegan. You should know that term. The ideal personal solution is to eat largely a plant-based diet and also have minimal waste. So if you're thinking about food and you just have blinders on thinking about food and how you eat, those are the two things to do to make sure that you're not wasting food. Maybe you're eating freegan in the sense that you're making sure you save all the food that you have at restaurants. You're not throwing away food at home. You're, maybe getting things past the best by date, things like that. And also being in this vein, which we talked about, which showed up in that alternate documentary, Waste It, is to eat things that we don't normally think about. So my example, I'll give it again, is, we eat beets, those root part of the vegetable, but the leafy greens you can eat as well. There are a whole range of things that you can eat that you buy that you may normally throw out. And it's something to think about when you do that. And the wonderful thing is now there's so many resources online, you can go and find out how to do things like cook beet tops, which cook like collard greens or kale or anything like that. So number 2, saving the planet begins at meals, again, when we eat for the good of the planet and its climate. I could have just said eat a largely plant-based diet here, but I want to expand this to be more of a climatarian view. And a climatarian is, of course, someone who eats for the good of the planet and its climate. That's the idea. The flexitarian is certainly the more common term, but it doesn't necessarily reference the climate the way climatarian does. So certainly being vegan or freegan is good, but being a combination of the two, which you could do if you ate for the good of the planet, makes more sense, right? So if you're a climatarian, not only would you eat a largely plant-based diet, because that's good, but you wouldn't be throwing the tops of those beets away. You'd be eating those as well. And this means you have to look at where things come from. Local is good, but their big problems are if it's being transported a great distance and if it has to come there quickly. So the example I gave, by the way, I'm going to give examples again. I'm going to get the same examples I gave from before in previous lectures, because it is kind of a recap here. The example I gave before is asparagus. If you buy asparagus this time of year, maybe a little bit earlier, like in January, most likely that asparagus had to be flown in from somewhere south of the equator, probably South America. And if that happened, the carbon footprint of that asparagus could be greater than eating chicken. So, and the reason is that air travel, as we've seen with air travel in general, adds a lot to the carbon footprint of things. By the way, just as a little aside, always watch ordering things that require air travel. So if you order things that come from other parts of the world and they have to get here very quickly, that's a problem. Apparently, Apple Computer has been recently addressing that, as they say that they're not flying like iPhones and all over to North America from when they're made in other parts of the world, but they're now coming by fast ships, which is not great, but a lot better than air travel. Yep. Project Drawdown noted that the number one thing that we can do to roll back global greenhouse gas emissions, doesn't involve wind turbines or anything like that. It's these top 2 things. Project Drawdown rightly notes that it's a staggering 137 gigatons of CO2 or equivalent gases could be saved every year by doing that. If you to look at these top 2 things, you can say, well, it's just food, it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. These top 2 things together, if we switch to all the photovoltaics that people are talking about across the planet, these 2 things would be bigger than twice as big as switching to photovoltaics. If you adopted electric vehicles, it's just a fraction. Electric vehicles are like 1/10 of this. So you keep hearing about how electric vehicles are going to be great. That's the big thing you can do. You don't need to go buy an electric car. You don't have to go it's not going to cost you anything. Do this. Eat more carefully. Eat as a climatarian, thinking, largely plant-based, where your food comes from, what's the carbon footprint of it, not wasting it, 10 times bigger than buying an electric car. I'm not saying electric cars are totally bad. I think EVs, electric vehicles, are fine, but we need more sensible ones like, mass transit, personal mobility options. And of course, I'm not saying that technology is bad. I just want to underscore that. I keep saying it. I mean, I think we should continue with EV production and also, exploring new ways of doing it, although would be things like mass transit. Saving the planet begins, number 3, in the bedroom when we use contraception and limit family size. So remember, Project Drawdown, you look at number 3, that's where we got to this issue of why contraception's needed. Why is it needed? Globally, there are 85 million unintended pregnancies every year. 32 million of those, that's about 38%, result in births. In the US, nearly half, 45% of all pregnancies in the US are unintended. That's why contraception is so important. So it's both having access to birth control that's important and actually using it, as well as having as a last resort abortion as an option. It's obviously here. And in fact, what's so interesting, these 3 are both so big, and don't take it from me, take it from Project Drawdown. They're the top 3 things you can do, but they're all deeply personal things. They're things that you're actually doing with your body. The difficulty is, while it is personal and you can think, it's personal, full stop. Well, no, because it used to be when I gave this lecture, and I've been giving variations of it for years, I would note that in South America, as a continent, 97% of women, people with a uterus, do not have access to birth control. 97%. And, it was meant to be kind of a contrast to North America, where it's different. And yet now with, Roe v. Wade being overturned, it's not different here either. Contraception is being limited, and what should be this incredibly personal issue, between you and your partner or partners suddenly is not. The government is involved. And also, we're going to get to the second list of 10 things that you can do regarding like political action and all. This is an example of why that's an intersectional issue, because if you don't address the politics of what's going on in this country, it's a huge problem. Saving the planet begins in the classroom when we fairly and equally educate boys and girls. Back to Project Drawdown, remember how important education of girls and women is, and in part because these are people with a uterus, or anyone with a uterus has more children. And, why this is important, because, the global population is increasing so much. And the good news is, here's the answer. You don't need policies like we had in China in the 20th, the 2-child and then 1-child policy, where the government in a very sort of heavy-handed way tries to step in and make sure you only have, 1 or 2 children. It's much easier. You just educate from as early an age as possible people that have a uterus and let them make the choice, because we know from study after study after study, the choice they will make is to have fewer children. This goes across the board from areas that are very poor by comparison to the US, those countries that where you have a great deal of poverty. Educational level for girls is 5th grade. So 5th grade is where you stop. And not surprisingly, those countries have on average 6 children per person with a uterus. Go to even a country like across Europe, the country with the highest level of education of women, the highest number of PhDs would be Italy, where they also have the lowest birth rate. In the United States, if you have a person with a uterus who just gets a high school education or not even finishing high school, they will on average have one more child than if that same person went and got a college education. And of course, just to be very clear, well, first off, this would roll back 103 gigatons of CO2 emissions. Absolutely huge. And just to be very clear, obviously, this is an issue for everyone. Girls and boys should be educated with respect to contraception and all. It's obviously an issue for men as well. And to be very clear, we're not putting the responsibility on those individuals that have a uterus. We're putting the responsibility on the institutions and how it impacts them. So with respect to contraception, Do they have access to contraception? Do they have access as a last resort to abortion? Do they have access to education? Who's controlling those things? It's a personal thing, but it is being controlled by folks in power. And even though, it's obvious contraception is a male issue as well. I mean, honestly, if you look at where education is very disparate, where boys go through further grades than girls with education, or just statistically get higher education. I mean, obviously patriarchy is alive and well and working strongly there. And of course, something that we've noted throughout the course is that, and this is a particularly good example of it, this is a win-win, right? Or win-win-win maybe. So rolling back 103 gigatons of CO2, significant impact on the climate crisis, great. Educating girls and women across the planet, I mean, that's terrific. I mean, even if you knew nothing about the environmental consequences, I think we should all get on board for that and do everything we can. I think everyone on the planet, everyone on the planet with a uterus should absolutely have reproductive control of their own bodies. They should have control of their own bodies, full stop, but reproductive control as well. So and I say this because I think it's right also as the father of a daughter. I think it's important. So, but the interesting thing about these, and something we'll talk about maybe a little later in the list, they are intersectional, right? So providing access to contraception, providing access to education is a personal issue, it's a cultural issue, it's a political issue, and it's also, as we've seen with these numbers, an environmental issue. So saving the planet begins, number 5, on the way to work, when we walk, bike, or use public transportation rather than owning and using a car. By the way, you see I've phrased these, each one of them, like Fowler's book, begins on the way to work. Because why? We've seen these numbers. For the average American, 25% of our climate footprint comes from owning a typical car. Typical car produces 4.6 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases. And it's even bigger than that because the emissions released in making the car is on average 11 metric tons. And it's coincidentally, cars only last about 11 years on average. And so if you think about it, that's it's 22 metric tons divided by 11 years. So it's 22 metric tons, if I didn't say that correctly. Divided by 11 is 2 metric tons per year, which means that according to the Paris Agreement, that's all that we should be releasing is 2 metric tons a year. So if you buy a car and never drive it, never take it out of your driveway, just the emissions in producing it would take your entire quota of 2 metric tons per year of CO2 emissions. And you might say, well, that's just ridiculous. Who could live with 2 metric tons of CO2 emissions? Most people on the planet do. We've seen people like Peter Kalmus, some of the people in the movie Damien tomorrow do as well. So transportation is huge. Next, saving the planet begins at home when we choose to live in an appropriate sized dwelling or co-housing instead of an average that's oversized home in the US, let alone a true McMansion. Why is this important? Even bigger than transportation, the largest chunk of the average American's carbon footprint, about a third of it, in fact, comes from our homes, from heating and cooling them, as well as energy used, such as lighting and appliances. So what's to be done? Well, this is another super simple answer. I mean, you could hope that there'll be new technology that someday will make McMansions carbon neutral. It's just not going to happen. If you think it takes a lot of emissions to produce a car, and it does, imagine what it takes to produce even a small home. It's about 85 metric tons, by the way. So if you thought a car's 22 was a lot, even a small house. But then when you get into larger, and the way houses are being built today, real problem. So what's the answer? It's very simple. Live somewhere smaller. That could be a tiny house, micro apartment, or as we've seen with the documentary Happy, co-housing. It can greatly reduce your carbon footprint. So if you think about it, then just the last 2 things that I've done, number 5, which is transportation, number 6 with housing, that's 25% and 33%. That's over half of your carbon footprint right there. So if you can reduce that, you can dramatically reduce your carbon footprint. And actually, the answer to that, which I mentioned in one of the pre-recorded documentaries, is absurdly easy. So it's absurdly easy to reduce your house footprint, how live in a smaller place, live in co-housing, but move to a city. And in fact, that's the big trend. In 2011, we switched, we hit a milestone where half of the people on the planet now live in cities. It's about 54%. Why is that the case? Well, if you live in a city, you live in a very dense city like Manhattan, a third of the people just walk to work. Only 20% use a car. If you've been in Manhattan, you wouldn't want to use a car. So that can take care of your transportation dramatically because you could walk, bike, or use mass transit, all of which would be available, more available there certainly than out in a suburb. And the other thing is that, if you live in a city, if you live in a place like Manhattan, you may have noticed, or you just switch coasts, you could talk about San Francisco or Seattle, that dwellings are much smaller. So, I mean, to live in a McMansion-sized place in a city would be many, many millions of dollars. That's why people keep going out into the suburbs and building them. So people live in much smaller places there. People live together and sort of co-housing there and all. So it's a very easy thing to do. It's a cultural change. Just live in a city. You don't really have to think about it much because A, you probably won't want a car, and B, you probably wouldn't want or certainly couldn't afford a very large dwelling. Saving the planet begins, number 7, on vacation and when traveling. When we choose slow travel over air travel, which is environmentally the worst way to get around. So as I mentioned in that one documentary, air travel people don't think is a big deal because why? It's only 2 or 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But as you'll see this week, when you calculate your own carbon footprint, which is the assignment for one of the 2 assignments for this week, for many Americans, it doubles the carbon footprint for them. And we just kind of have to call it out and say what it is. Air travel is a practice of the privileged people on the planet. 19 out of 20 people will never step in an airplane. Period. Half of Americans do not fly annually, period. Even, if you look at the problem globally, we started off by talking about 1% and how their carbon footprint is so much higher. It's been estimated that just 1% of people on the planet emit 80% of the emission, require the release of 80% of the emissions for air travel. So air travel overwhelmingly is just the very tip, the wealthiest people on the planet who are doing 80% of the emissions for it. You might be one of them. So the alternative is to find other ways of getting around, maybe slow travel. Slow travel is like the ideal thing if you want to actually, do slow traveling either by biking or going to like Airbnb to Airbnb by way of bicycle or camping or something, or just to do the simple thing. And again, it's very simple. Fly less. If you're flying, 5 times a year, could you bring it down to 1 time a year? I'm not telling you have to, but I'm just saying you could. That would bring it down to 20% of what it was. So it's one of those things that for most people on the planet, and again, if I were teaching this in another country, I wouldn't even have this on the list because most people, depending on where we were, most people in the room probably have never flown, would never fly. That's not the case with this room, unfortunately. Saving the planet begins, number 8, in stores and online, when we choose not to buy yet more unnecessary stuff, clothing and otherwise. Minimalism, which we've talked about, is hardly new. Most people throughout human history have been minimalists in that they've, had to get by on absolute minimum or nearly so. And this applies not just to people, in the past, but today. Most people on the planet are, by US standards, minimalist because they, just don't have much in life. But what we're talking about here and why it's so important, like to us, is voluntary minimalism, opt-in minimalism, where you choose not to, for environmental and other reasons, consume lots and lots of stuff. Many people believe that responding to the climate crisis on a personal level will then mean that we need to do without a lot. So if you're saying buy less, have less, people are going to say, well, that's less? Why would we want to opt in for less? Even if we want to do it, we have to accept the possibility that it would mean drab lives of deprivation. But what's really interesting, and why I had you look at minimalists, at Thoreau, at Peter Kalmus, because for all these people, 170 years ago, Thoreau was sending out the same message. Yes, it's minimal, but it's better. Not just environmentally. Peter Kalmus comes at it from an environmental point of view, but I hope he got across in the documentary, his life is better. He feels that it's better. His life is happier. The minimalists don't even address it as an environmental point of view, but they come out and say they are happier for that. So it's not like this is as bad as it sounds. It's contradictory. It's paradoxical in a consumer culture where we're told that you need to consume to be happy, and we're told that daily and hourly and by the minute when you're online. But if you don't approach it from that point of view, having less could mean having more and better. Saving the planet begins, number 9, offline, when we barter, borrow, rent, or otherwise exchange, as well as repair things rather than buying still more stuff. So in that documentary with Peter Kalmus, Being the Change, and in the alternate documentary that week, Damien, if you haven't watched it, you still could. It's on GauchoCast. We need a number of people who, live very sustainable lives, who actually are at the end point for, Western wealthy countries. Each of those, for good reason, drew attention to how things like bartering, borrowing, renting, repairing things significantly reduce the acquisition of stuff. Yeah, can you do that? Sure. I mean, you can thrift, you can barter, share things with people. It's now possible to rent clothing. You can do all this, and you can do it yourself. And by the way, if you do decide to move to a city, choose wisely, because there are some cities where you can do a lot of this, where it's already structurally set up, where you can barter and borrow and rent things. So in one of the documentaries, we saw, for example, in Berkeley, California, just like you have a library where you go to get books, you also have a local place where you can go borrow tools. So if you want to start a garden and you think, oh, I need to get a shovel, I need rake, I need a hoe, I need all those things. Well, you don't. All you have to do is stop there and borrow them. If you need a repair in your house and you need a drill, everyone in the room doesn't have to have a drill. You can just go and borrow one. I mean, if you think about the advantage here, think of all the stuff we have in our houses for things like that. So if you come from suburbs, everybody has a shovel, everybody has a rake, everybody has a hoe. And how many hours a week, a year do they actually get used? Not a lot. So why not have a system where you could just take those things out, just like a book, as you need it? And you can in places. Saving the planet begins, number 10, with buying, but not only by buying less, sharing and keeping things longer, but also by buying from companies with environmentally sound and socially just practices. I put this at the end because it's one of the things that people might go to first and say, well, if I just buy from an environmentally sound brand, say like clothing, just throw something out like Reformation or something, there are plenty of them out there, well, that's okay. But the problem is you do have to cut down the buying too. So it's not like if you suddenly came into a lot of money, you shift from buying from Shein and Forever 21, and you shift to Reformation, and you still buy 60 plus items a year. You do want to keep down that, and that's where the minimalists sort of come in. And why, and again, just to underscore it, this is another big intersectional issue. We saw it in the True Cost. We saw how people are impacted across the planet by making the stuff that we have. So, social justice, environmental justice, climate justice, they're all not only interrelated and intertwined, but there really is an intersectional issue here. So when you do buy, you do have a chance to use that phrase, vote with your dollars. Again, I think Thoreau's argument is vote differently with your action, but don't vote with your dollars, just buy less. But if you don't support, if everyone right now across the planet said we're not going to buy fast fashion anymore, Shein and all would go away, and democracy, capitalism being what it is, suddenly more and more places like Reformation would pop up, which would argue that they were producing things with better working conditions and all for everyone involved. You know, if you think of it, the last things I've just been talking about buying and consuming and all last three things, they have a big carbon footprint just by themselves. And why is that? For the average American, I mentioned a quarter of your carbon footprint comes from driving your car and owning a car. A third comes from your house. But another quarter, 25%, comes from all the stuff that you buy. And, you know, as Peter Kalmus rightly noted, you can just pull way back and look at it. And that is every dollar that you spend amounts to 1 more pound of carbon dioxide or equivalent gases put in the atmosphere. Sure, you can try to find brands that do less of it, but by consuming less and buying from those brands, it can make a huge difference. So that's the top 10. Let's take an iClicker poll. This, again, you should know. Find my oops, I'll go back. What is silvopasture? We'll let a few more people respond. And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if there are questions in the Q&A. And there are. Let's see this answer first. So most people got the right answer. I hope that's on the exam as well. So a number of questions here, or 3 questions. These are in the Q&A. People have just put in Q&As, obviously open and working since I got questions. So if you have more, put them in. But question 1, from your point of view, from a point of view about car emissions, how does buying a used car affect carbon emissions? Are the emissions a lot less buying a new car? Or does it not have a big impact? Yeah, I mean, the best thing is no car, but certainly it's good at this moment in time if it's a relatively efficient car. The problem is it depends on the car, really. So if a car is, you know, you may think, well, I'll just get like a classic car, like a VW bus from the 60s, because they're kind of cool. The problem is before 1978, I think that year is right, they produced 10 times as much point source pollution in the form of sulfur dioxide because catalytic converters were not required then. In general, car emissions have gone steadily down over the years. So if it's a relatively efficient car, sure. Like, you know, if you have an old Prius or something, which is the one car that my partner and I share in addition to the e-bike, yeah, that's makes sense rather than buying a new car. One of the difficulties with cars, and I mentioned electric cars, everyone thinks that they're sort of the savior of all things. Well, we've seen the emission savings aren't that great. Plus, producing one of those generally produces about 68% more emissions than an internal combustion engine car. So that's an issue. Is unicycling more environmentally efficient than bicycling? No, it's not. And anyone who doesn't believe that, I challenge them to a race on their unicycle with me on a bicycle, because bicycles is actually faster. People have argued, by the way, and they've done this for the last 40 years, that if you look across the planet, the most efficient traveler on the planet, what would that be? So I'm talking about all animals and all too. So you might think it's a hawk that can just, you know, glide through the air and coast and all. But people have actually looked at the numbers and seen what sort of emissions they have, or what sort of energy is required to get around. And as long as you have good roads, which we do, the most efficient form of transportation on the planet is a bicycle. And more recently, people have compared traditional analog bikes, you know, people-powered bikes, to pedelecs, where they have electric motor as well. And when you run the numbers, e-bikes are actually better. Why is that? Because you have to fuel the person doing the pedaling, and especially depends on how you're fueling them. So if you're fueling them with beef and meat and all, you're getting a lot of emissions to get that amount of energy out. Whereas an e-bike, they have like a 500-watt battery. You can have a single solar panel, which like 6 feet wide, 40 inches high, and that will give you more power than that person. So yeah. Which pre-recorded lecture should we watch? It can be a bit confusing on GauchoCast with titles. So don't look to GauchoCast for the pre-recorded lectures. Look on the individual web page, which you can access through Canvas, but those 5 web pages are what you should be looking at. So go to those for week 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 and look. It'll tell you what you should be reading, what you should be watching. It'll have the 2 lectures that I delivered, which have now been uploaded, except for this one, which I'll do later today. And it'll also have the extra ones too. So, okay, I think that's it for those. Let me just check. Okay, so back to here and next one. Similarly, but on a somewhat different note, saving the planet also begins in the following 10 ways. So I'm really continuing their list of 20 things on the list, but these 10 are a little different, as you'll see. Saving the planet begins 11 at the polling place when we cast our vote for candidates from local to federal, advocating for sweeping climate policies such as carbon pricing and the Green New Deal. Yeah, so why is this so important? Personal action can only go so far. So again, you're concerned about methane emissions, you stop eating meat, you try to waste as little as possible. Everything that you could do, everything that everyone on the planet can do is not going to be quite as big as stopping the fracking industry. Fracking industry is this environmentally disastrous way of getting oil and gas out of the ground. It releases methane in the process. So it's just not enough. Personal action isn't enough. You know, you can't end it. So how do you end it? You need to vote and become politically active, calling for legislation to, you know, to ban fracking. And we're at a good moment in history because there are politicians running for office, if you pay attention, who actually put that into their platform. So it's a strange moment in history because you have, say, in 2016, you know, Donald Trump running for office saying he would eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency. He would not do any climate action. He would not, you know, sign on to COP21. And on the other hand, you have people like Bernie Sanders proposing, it actually got proposed in 2020, the Ban Fracking Act. It's a federal bill. It's not the same as the Green New Deal. It's a separate bill, but it would simply ban fracking altogether. AOC is behind it, Bernie Sanders behind it. A number of candidates who ran against Joe Biden last time were behind it. So it absolutely, and including Bernie Sanders. So it's really important to vote. Saving the planet begins number 12, again at the polling place when we vote for candidates and initiatives to put people and the planet ahead of corporate interests. So it's a little different than the one I just said, because the one I just said is vote for climate. So you can be a climatarian in how you eat. I don't know that there's a phrase for it other than a green voter, and you vote for the climate when you vote. But, you know, if we think more broadly, is there a range of other problems and injustices in the world, both environmental and social justice needs our attention. Yeah. So if you think about it, these are often intersectional and interconnected. So beef, we talked about beef. My beef with beef has been that it causes greenhouse gases to be emitted, principally methane. But on the other hand, it, you know, it requires incredible habitat loss. 40% of this planet, of this country, of the US, 40% would be regained. The United States, you know, 40% of the country could go back to being used for other things. It could go back to being the sort of wilderness that it was. We could do permaculture, silvopasture, all sorts of things like that. Many trillions of gallons of water are being used for things for that. Waste removal, pathogen runoff, range of issues relating to herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, and so forth. None of those herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, they're not environmental issues per se, but they are environmental issues. So when we think about it, you know, you really want candidates, and like AOC would be another example, who have a very cohesive plan to deal with all of this. So you need to vote for those sort of environmental initiatives. Even though it may not seem that it's related, they often can be. So if you voted to price methane, to price carbon or equivalent gases like methane, beef industry would be greatly diminished in the US, which would have all those things. And of course, we saw in the true cost, you know, horrific social justice problems across the planet, and that could be solved too on, you know, individual federal level. And what I mean by that is, well, if we said that you could not bring any, you know, manufactured good into the United States that the person didn't have, who made it, didn't have a living wage protections and environmental protections to that place it was made as well, that could be absolutely huge. Saving the planet begins prior to the polling place, as we explained to 5 or more of our friends and family the importance of voting on behalf of our planet, its climate, and all the life that lives on it. And this goes to the communication issue, right? So, if you can, communicate to people who, convince them to actually vote in the last 2 ways, either directly for the climate or more broadly for the planet and its life, if you think about it, because voting can have more impact than any one thing you can do, full stop, by a long stop. And I'm talking about all the things in that first group of 10, whether it's going to a plant-based diet, ditching your car, moving to a co-housing facility. Voting can be bigger than all that. Then here, suddenly, how can you leverage it 5 times bigger? And you can, by convincing 5 friends of the importance of it. And maybe not even just the importance of all the things, all these issues, but just, hey, just getting out and voting. The difficulty is, and I've said it before, your generation in particular is being well out leveraged by my generation. And it's easy enough to see, because per capita, people in my generation are literally voting twice as much in the US as your generation. You would outnumber them if you just got out and voted in the same way. But they are having a disproportionate impact on the planet and a whole range of issues. So if you're not happy with the world for lots of reasons, and there are, lots of reasons not to be happy with the world, this is the one big thing you can do to vote and to convince your friends to vote. And it'll have many times. So, switching to plant-based diet, terrific. I eat a largely plant-based diet. But this is many times bigger. Voting is many times bigger. Convincing your friends to vote is many times bigger. And just letting them know of the issues. Saving the Planet begins, number 14, at gathering places, when we become activists by joining together and collectively demand climate action, such as with the Sunrise Movement. I mentioned them, they're local here. I mentioned in one of the recorded lectures, you should know this if you've watched it, that 2 out of 3 people in Copenhagen bike to work or school. This didn't happen because of government action. It's not like one day in Copenhagen in the late 1970s, when this all got started, that the government said, we're going to make sweeping changes to bicycle infrastructure and make it, ultimately what it became today, 50 years later, into this dominant form of transportation. It was the tireless work of activists for decade after decade, activists who did things like on the side of road where people had been killed by cars on bicycles, they made little shrines to make a note of it. And by the way, that is the number one problem with bicycling, in that over 90% of all fatalities on bicycles don't involve bicycles hitting each other or anything like that. Over 90% involve cars and bicycles. You're on a bicycle and you come up against a 5,000-pound car, you will not win. It's just the way it is. But these activists did that. They did more forceful activist events, like where they would literally shut down streets, or a group of bicycles, like 20 bicycles, would get on a major road, a busy road, and just drive it at bicycle speed, 12 or 13 miles an hour, and make everyone slow down. Some of the tactics were successful, others not, but over time, with their effort, this is what they ultimately did. So does collective activism work? There's my example. There are lots of other examples of it, but it surely does. So, and again, I've said, you're in luck, you're here at UCSB. There are all sorts of activities on campus, all sorts of like-minded people you can meet up with, all sorts of things you can do. But the simple way of putting it is, just don't think you can do this by yourself. You can't do it by yourself. But the great thing is there are plenty of people who are also mobilized trying to do it. And the really good thing is you'll meet like-minded people, and it could be a rewarding experience in its own right. Saving the Planet begins by protesting, and through acts of peaceful civil disobedience, such as Greta Thunberg's protest outside of the Swedish parliament. This is related to the first one, but ramping it up a little. So it's not only being involved. So I'll give an example, which I actually want to give, shout out, applause to, like, Associated Students Recycling on campus. What they do is absolutely great. They've been around for a long time. It's phenomenal. But this is different. This is actually out there actively protesting. And Greta Thunberg, I think, is a wonderful example because she was, pretty average high school student, though she had this extraordinary ability to focus on a single issue. But her act of civil disobedience, which, if you don't know, every Friday she went on strike from school, didn't go to school, sat outside the British Parliament saying that she was on strike. And it sounds like a minor thing, but look what it did. And it's something to think about what true civil disobedience in the version of, what Thoreau first argues for in civil disobedience. There are other people before him, but he pulls it together in kind of a modern sense. And then people like Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King, the sort of protests that they were able to do, which were incredibly effective. In Gandhi's case, of course, freeing India from the yoke of colonial British rule, and the civil rights movement had enormous gains. Although, unfortunately, as we now know with Black Lives Matter, should have known all along that those gains were not sufficient, that we still have more to do. And civil disobedience may continue with that. Saving the Planet begins, number 16, with reading, as we learn more about the climate crisis and what's being done, as well as why nearly enough isn't being done. I've argued, and this is coming from someone with the literature background, that reading is one of the most important skills that we need in the climate crisis. You might think that it would be any number of other things, but as we've seen with the climate change denial week that we had, there are powerful interests, fossil fuel industry and its affiliates and others, who are spending many, many millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars every year to confuse the American public. And the irony is, any college-educated American deserving of the college degree should be able to read through facts concerning the climate crisis to conclude that it represents a real and present danger to our country, to our planet, to each of us. Really, a high school education should be well enough. But, from your point of view, just keep reading about it. And there are fortunately many reliable sources on the internet. I would throw out InsideClimateNews.com. It's terrific. They've written Pulitzer award-winning articles, and they're just great. So if you want to continue learning more about this after this class and you're not taking English 24, no worries. Just continue reading, because I think it's very important, especially as things change and as priorities change, as governments change. You really need to keep up on this. I say this out of personal experience because I have to read constantly because so much is changing, but it can be done. Saving the Planet begins, 17, with rethinking, as we individuals in a diverse range of human cultures take a long, hard look at how we inhabit the planet. So there's a great book you might want to read if you're interested in reading more, called This Changes Everything. It's a little dated now. I think it's 2014, so 10 years old. But This Changes Everything could very easily be turned into an imperative, a command, and that is, we need to change everything. We can't just hope that technology will save us and let us do the same thing. So cars are a perfect example. Why is the electric car, so successful to the extent that it is? Because it doesn't change anything. You get to have a car, the same size car, holds as many people, every bit as powerful, more powerful, faster, and you get to do everything the same exact way you've always done it, except you've switched to a different kind of power for that car. That's appealing because you don't have to change anything. The fact is, we need to do changes. And in that example, transportation example, we need to change to mass transit, personal mobility options, and all that. Those are the kind of cultural changes. We have to accept that we need to make sweeping changes to our culture, to our lives across the planet. But again, the people who've reported on their experiments of doing that, from Thoreau to Peter Kalmus, have argued that, it's better. And, another example of something we need to radically rethink and redo would be consumerism, right? Consumerism, in the case of where it is now in late capitalism, free market capitalism, consumerism is just completely, utterly unsustainable. That has to change. Consumer culture has to be taken out of the picture and something new has to supplant it. We've seen people with different efforts as to what that could be. And also it makes a point, just to be clear, because this is in the second set of things. It's not like, again, you can just stop buying things yourself. I mean, it's good, but you're only 1 in a billion people, does not move the needle. Instead, we need major cultural changes. And this was why, going back to voting, it's important because we need a culture that would limit how advertising works. So an example I gave before is, people have argued, a friend of mine ran for parliament in England on this ticket, that what he wanted to do is make sure that you could not advertise to a child under 12 years old, because we are creating, those corporations are creating a whole generation of consumers, rampant consumers. That's their goal. And they're creating them at a young age so that by the time they're age 12, it's over. Why? Because they're consumers. They will be consumers for life. They have been trained to be consumers. It sounds like the Matrix, kind of like there's what powering the system, like, you know, people were in the Matrix, but it is true, and we need to change that, because it is, you know, unsustainable. And as we've seen, like with Happy and other things, doesn't make you happy anyhow. You're told it makes you happy. You might think it makes you happy. Think about it. It doesn't make you happy. That's why I call this rethinking and rethink everything. Saving the Planet begins, number 18, by sharing what we know and do with others, so that they too have a better understanding of the climate crisis and what can be done. Yeah. In one of my lectures on climate and generation, which you should have watched, I noted that that maxim that knowledge is power, which is generally attributed to the Renaissance thinker Francis Bacon, but actually is sort of Bacon's interpretation of an Old Testament verse. But anyhow, knowledge is power is not enough. And by that, I mean, knowledge is only power when acted upon. If you don't act upon knowledge, knowledge is nothing. It's just, it doesn't do anything. It's just knowledge. And moreover, you need knowledge, because if you try just to jump out and act, then you can do rash and haphazard action without thinking on it first. So if you want to do something with what you've read about and what you've learned and you're rethinking, again, communication is important, because you need to share that. And that can either be through just your life, right? In the sense that, you know, your action is the best way to communicate. People see the way that you live, they could ask questions about it. Or if you read a lot about it, which I'm suggesting by, you know, going on to something like Inside Climate News, then you can answer questions that people may have. That people may say to you, you know, is you know, education really important to the climate? How could that? I've heard someone says to you, I've heard that education is somehow important to the climate crisis. How could that be? Well, you now know from this class. Education of people with a uterus is huge. Education in general is huge, because all the disinformation is out there and so forth. So effectively communicating what you know to others is incredibly important. Saving the Planet begins, number 19, by joining with others in initiatives from local to global, such as Freegan and bicycle collectives, so that we can support each other. So I'm not talking about activism, which I did a couple numbers prior here. But, you know, say you wanted to be a Freegan, say you wanted to eat food that you got from like local stores and all, that was past its sell-by date, that was going to be thrown away. Well, you know, I think most people would think that's pretty odd. Most of your friends are going to think that's pretty odd. I mean, they're going to say, isn't that dumpster diving? I mean, are you really doing that? But, you know, Peter Kalmus, and look at his example, he actually put together and is involved in a community of people who are Freegans, who do this not only to provide food for themselves, but also for people who need it, like unhoused populations of where they live and all. But if you think about it, doing that doesn't make you feel like you're this sort of outside one-odd person, but instead collectively fits you into a group of people that normalizes the behavior, that says, well, people think, well, this is really an important thing to do. If you were involved with the people who really enthusiastically got on board for it, they of course would think this is a good thing to do. It's a good thing for the planet. It's a good thing for people that need food that's being shared with, and so on. So I think it's useful to think about initiatives joining in. It, again, doesn't have to be actively protesting, riding your bike and shutting down a street or something like that. It can be, but it could also just be with day-to-day things. Freegan I give as an example, but it could just be, you want to raise some of your food. There are local allotments you can get in towns. You can go there. You may not know how to do it, but actually, if you go to allotments, it's a great place to do it because you'll meet people there. What allotments are, if you don't know, most cities have them. You have them in Goleta, have them in Ivy, have them in Santa Barbara. It's like a small lot. It's a farm. It's divided into small, individual plots of like 10 square feet. You're given that land to grow whatever you want there. You may not know how to grow, but there are, dozens or more people around you. You can learn from them how to do it because you can, share and take part in those initiatives. Saving the Planet begins 20 with us as we become, to echo a phrase often attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. The quote phrase is, be the change that you want to see in the world. It's where Peter Kalmus got his title from, Be the Change. The fact is, and this is going to sound odd for someone who just gave a lecture series on it, but talk is cheap. The fact is frequently brought to light by the detractors of climate activists. People look at Al Gore and they say, oh, guy flies on private jets, forget anything he has to say. It's related to this issue that knowledge is not enough by itself. You need to enact it to be that change, because it announces to the world your commitment to the process, to what's going on, and also suggests a way forward. Because many people wonder, how will we get past the climate crisis? It's so bad. Is there anything you can do? So that's why a whole new generation of climate activists try to stick to this maxim. So Greta Thunberg would be an example. When it came time for her to cross the Atlantic to go to a conference, which ironically got rescheduled, she didn't take a plane, but instead took a boat across the Atlantic. So this group of 10, the second group of 10 of the 20, it's not an exhaustive list, but I focus not on technological things. You could do that. It is important to have things like wind turbines and all, but rather it's about people embodying the change, thinking about the change they want. Yeah. So there's 21st coming up, just so you know. But note that the first 10 and the second 10 of the things on our list suggest, as I suggested in the very beginning of class, personal, cultural, economic, and political changes rather than technological solutions. Again, technological solutions are not bad, but it's just not enough until we think about these kinds of things. And again, there are a bunch of them. It's a pretty concrete list. Also note that the 20 things on our list are aimed at wealthy people in wealthy countries, just to clarify that. I've noted before a number of times the poorest 3 billion people on the planet have emitted just 5% of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Only a few of the things on the list is going to apply to them, right? So air travel, no. Again, 19 out of 20 people never get an airplane. Have a car? No. It's in the United States, where almost 800 out of 1,000 people have a car. Compare that to Bangladesh, when only 4 people out of 1,000 have a car. It's again irrelevant, but it is relevant to you folks and to everyone in this room, including me. Yeah. And I note here kind of tongue in cheek, if there's one thing that people in low and moderate income countries could do to be absolutely huge, it would be to somehow succeed in convincing people in wealthy countries to stop emitting greenhouse gases. So it is the case that this is, it's a joke, but it's not meant to be. This is a problem caused by the wealthy people on the planet, and that would be us. And these are the kind of solutions that we could do. One more approach needs to be mentioned. This is my bonus one. Saving the planet begins with your choice of major or career, I would argue. It's it at you, my students, as you'll soon be thinking about careers that you can embark on, though it really applies to anyone. And I note that, including myself, because I started as a career as a professor, didn't go back to get my PhD until I was 42. It's never too late to think about devoting yourself in different ways, even professionally, to doing that. Students often come to me, I noted here, and ask what sort of professions they can take up that would have an impact on the climate crisis. And they would expect that there would be very, like a short list of them. And that I would suggest, and since I do have a joint appointment in environmental studies, that you become an ES major. And also might think, because I approach it from this humanities perspective, that maybe that's the answer. But the simple fact is that almost anything that you can think of will have a profound environmental and climate footprint. And we've seen, for example, communication with the documentaries that we've seen, like people like Kip Anderson made Cowspiracy. But it not only applies to filmmakers. And if you watch that alternate film to The True Cost, the Patriot Act episode, you may have seen there was a comedian who made that. And you wouldn't think that if you wanted to do something to make an intervention in the climate crisis to help mitigate the problem, what could you do or what could you be? Comedian may not come up, but anything is. And of course, and the STEM fields would apply, but certainly things like law, politics, policymaking, urban planners. And if you watch that documentary, The Alternative to Cowspiracy, Wasted, even chefs can play an important role here. So I know when I was in graduate school, one of my advisors gave me some really good advice, and that you should focus on whatever you feel really passionate about. Not everybody follows this advice, as people, sometimes devote their lives to doing good in the world and where they think it's going to be most important. But I would argue you should really focus on what you feel most passionate about. The simple fact is, pretty much any field can have an impact on the climate crisis. If this is not already apparent in your case, just do a little research. My guess is that within a few minutes of online research, you'll find people who share your interest in addressing the climate crisis. So if you wanted to be a chef, if you wanted to open a restaurant or something, just look for that with respect to climate. You'll find it. If you can't find any, you should shoot me an email, and I might be able to help with that. Okay, here it is, the last slide of the lecture series. So you've had this one before. What's the idea of Hathor about? Okay, well, while you're filling that out, thanks so much for sticking through the entire lecture series, and I will see you Thursday. And do people know the right answer? Yes, you do. It is, in fact, D. Okay.